In example 1, we're looking at finding the square roots of numbers. And again, remember that what we're looking for is whatever number is squared is going to equal the number under the radical. So with number 1, we have the square root of 144, and we should recognize that that is the same thing as the square root of 12 squared. So the square root of 144 equals 12. So with number 2, we're asking ourselves, what number squared equals negative 81? But we know that any number, when it's squared, will be positive, because two negatives, a negative times a negative makes a positive, and a positive times a positive equals a positive. So there is no number that will equal negative 81 when it's squared, and therefore we know that there is no real solution. With number 3, we have our first decimal in the example. We're still looking for what number squared is going to equal that decimal. It's similar to the first problem, if you notice, because the first problem had 144, and here we have 1.44. So what number squared equals 1.44? Well, that's going to be 1.2. So this equals the square root of 1.2 squared, which equals 1.2. Now with number 4, unlike number 2 where the radical had the negative on the inside, we have a negative on the outside. So essentially what that means is that we find the square root of what's under the radical, and then we just apply the negative. So what number squared is going to equal 2.25? Well, that's the same thing as 1.5 times 1.5, or 1.5 squared. So this equals the negative square root of 1.5 squared, which simply equals negative 1.5. And the point mainly of this problem was to point out the difference between number 2 and number 4. With number 2, the negative sign is on the inside of the radical, and there's no number squared that's going to equal a negative number, so we end up with no real solution. But with number 4, the radical is on the outside, or the negative sign is on the outside of the radical, and therefore we just apply the negative after we find the square root. With number 5, we have a fraction. You can look at it a couple of ways. We'll learn later on that this is the same thing as the square root of 1 over the square root of 4. But essentially, we're just looking for what number squared equals 1/4. Well, that's going to be 1/2, because 1/2 times 1/2 equals 1/4. So the square root of 1/4, we could look at it as the square root of 1/2 squared, which equals 1/2.